Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Myers, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the UCLA History Department. And I'm delighted to introduce this distinguished panel in just a minute. Actually, the moderator to the panel will introduce the panel. I will introduce the moderator. But I'm thrilled to see so many of you for this important event. And I'm also thrilled that we were able to assemble a truly distinguished panel of our own faculty colleagues and some friends from outside of the university. It's really an auspicious occasion to be together. And I think when I think of this evening, I think of it as the result of three convergent vectors. The first vector that necessitates our appearance here is the presence of two extraordinary women, devoted alumni of the UCLA History Department, steadfast supporters of the study of history, and dear friends of UCLA, Barbara Berg and Jeri Alden. For 30 years, Barbara and Jeri and Barbara have supported the extraordinary project of the Friends of History, which allows for the intimate study of intriguing and important historical subjects in the intimate setting of a salon. They have been the pillars of strength of that extension of our mission as educators and transmitters of historical knowledge. And as we move forward over the next half year or so, we are going to be experimenting with new forums and venues in which we can engage in that kind of intimate conversation, under the supervision actually of my successor as chair of the UCLA History Department, Professor Steve Aaron. But I do want to take this opportunity to thank Jeri and Barbara and their families for their inspired generosity, which has meant so much to us and to this university. Thank you very much. The second vector that brings us here is, of course, our efforts to remember the Great War. It is hard to imagine our world, our political, social, cultural universe, without the enormous repercussive impact of the First World War. Not only did it introduce a scale of destruction that shattered all means of measurement hitherto, but the First World War was an event that really had no parallel. It really altogether shattered the geopolitical tectonics of our world. And we thought that it made sense on this centennial anniversary of the First World War to bring together experts over many different domains of the globe to reflect on those extraordinarily consequential tectonic shifts. The third reason why we're gathered here is because we are committed at UCLA to infusing historical knowledge and perspective into society, both on campus and beyond campus walls. We believe that historical knowledge, perspective, and depth are not luxuries, but really necessities. They're inherent social goods. And one of the ways in which we perform that vital mission as part of a great public university is through events like this, which allow us to translate the results of meticulous research into a wider audience so that we all can be better informed and therefore engage in civic life in a more robust fashion. This is work that relies on partners like you, and if you share in that belief that the infusion of historical knowledge and perspective is a social good and a necessity, then I encourage you to support the UCLA History Department. And should you, that deserves applause, I think so. Should you be so inclined to support the UCLA History Department, there are, just coincidentally enough, forms in the back that will facilitate that task. I want to also encourage you to attend our other events. We will be meeting in another month or so here in the Fowler Auditorium for our Why History Matters series, which will be moderated by Professor James Gelvin and devoted to the past, present, and future of the Middle East. We try and pick somewhat untopical themes, but we didn't succeed this time. That will be an extremely informative and important evening, and I encourage you all to come to that. In a minute, I'll hand things over to my distinguished colleague, our moderator, Professor Geoffrey Symcox. But before doing so, I just want to thank all those who attended to the many logistical details regarding this event tonight. From the UCLA Development Office, Kelly O'Leary, Kim Morris, Julie Strumwasser, from our own history department, the great Jessica Bellamy, Cariza and Lexi are also back. They really did an extraordinary job, and let's give them a nice round of applause. And now to introduce our panel and carry things away, Geoffrey Symcox. Geoffrey.
Yes, excuse me. We will be speaking in the following order. The first speaker will be my colleague, Professor Ivan Berend, then my colleague, Professor James Gelvin, followed by Professor Glenda Sluga from the University of Sydney in Australia, and finally, our colleague Scott Berg, who is an independent scholar who has written a number of important biographies. Now, let me start things off by talking about what I think is the most significant and awful legacy of the First World War, and that is the casualties. The casualties were of an unprecedented scale. And let me just give you some figures. The Allied countries, that is Britain, France, Italy, the United States, Russia, particularly Russia, mobilized 42 million men. Of them, 5.1 million were killed, 22 million wounded. So, 22 million total casualties. So your percentage is something around 50% of killed or wounded. The Central Powers, that is Germany, Austria, and their allies, mobilized 23 million. They lost 3.6 million killed. And they lost the total casualties were 15.4 million. The total casualty figures for World War I would be about 37 million men killed and wounded. Now, that sets, I think, the tone for discussion that we're going to have. Let me mention that I was a little boy growing up in England during the Second World War. And I remember my mother, we were at war, and my mother was always talking about the war. And she meant the First World War, because that was the one that was real to her. And she was a little girl. She lived in eastern England in the county of Essex. And she remembered in July 1916, she could hear the artillery that was preparing, the barrage of artillery that went on for a week, preparing for the Battle of the Somme. And for her, everything was very real still. My father served in the cavalry. He was a hussar, a dashing hussar, except he never dashed because the cavalry never did anything. He remained behind the lines at a place called Ypres, which the English soldiers called wipers, and he had what they said was a good war. My uncle, his brother, my Uncle Edgar, did not do so well. He was in a machine gun unit in the front line. May 1918, in the final German offensive, a shell landed near him, blew him up. He was invalided out with shell shock and ended up in the psychiatric hospital in Craiglockhart near Edinburgh. If you've read Pat Barker's novels about World War I, that's where he ended up. And his life was bent out of shape. Now, so much for, I think, the introduction. My colleague, let me introduce my colleague, Ivan Berend. Professor Berend is a very distinguished economic historian. He is a distinguished professor in the Department of History. He has been a professor of economic history at the Budapest University of Economics, rector of the university, a president of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and he is a fellow of several other academies, including the British Academy and the Austrian Academy. He has written extensively on the history of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. He has a 4-volume history of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. He also has an economic history of 20th century Europe in 2006. Europe since 1980, an economic history of 19th century Europe, and Europe in Crisis, A Bolt from the Blue, which is his most recent excursion into contemporary economics. He also has written a very interesting memoir called History in My Life, a memoir in 3 areas. So I give you my colleague, Professor Ivan Berend.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We are discussing about the First World War and its impact. Now, the First World War was, as already Geoffrey mentioned, a very unique war in many senses. Historians nowadays more or less agree that this war ended the 19th century and opened a terrible 20th century, an extreme dark period after that. Now, the war itself was unique from several respects as well. First of all, this war was the first industrialized war in history, a long war which introduced the most devastating weapons of the 20th century. Air bombing and tank attacks were introduced by the First World War, and this became, of course, weapons of the future. The war was also a kind of watershed because especially the German war system introduced something brand new in history, a planned economy, a state-run planned economy, which was extremely efficient and therefore strongly influenced the entire future. Many statements in the later years, especially revolutionary regimes, called the German war economy as their model. That was Mussolini who said that, Vladimir Lenin who said that. So the war economy also had a major impact on the future. Now, my friend Geoffrey mentioned this terrible devastation and death toll. I just want to add one element that at the end of the war, because the population starved and was weakened, the very infamous Spanish flu killed 20 million people in Europe. So at the end, it's added to the war loss, which at the end was about 50, 60 million people altogether. Now, the participant countries were destroyed, and about 2 generations' work was totally lost. For example, Austria and Belgium dropped back to the economic level they had in 1870, 1880. Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Britain dropped back to the 1890 level. So it needed years to recover. Actually, in 1925 was the first year when somewhat consolidation arrived. But it's also included the currency stabilization, because the war was followed by the most devastating inflation in history. Actually, 6 countries, including Germany, Austria, several East European countries, had a so-called hyperinflation, 2-3 digits inflation. For example, in Germany, 2 pounds of butter costed 5 billion Deutschmark. And the National Bank started printing 1,000 billion bills. No one accepted, actually. Anyway, the war itself, the devastation which followed, changed the world. But I should add that the peace which followed the war, the Versailles Treaty, contributed to that. To paraphrase the very famous saying of Karl von Clausewitz, this peace was actually nothing else than the continuation of the war in other means. Unfortunately, the United States and President Wilson withdrawn from the peace treaty. We will hear about that, so I'm not going to speak about it. And that was quite tragic, because the Wilsonian principles, the right of self-determination, for example, was used and abused by the peacemakers, mostly France. France played a really negative role as a peace treaty. I hope no one is French in the audience. Actually, they wanted $33 billion as reparation from Germany, which nowadays currency, it's about $500 billion, which was absolutely overstated. And interestingly enough, they required 75 billion francs for housing damages. Also, the whole French housing stock had a value of 60 billion. So it was totally nonsense. Actually, France wanted destroy a united Germany, but it did not work because Britain did not agree, so they had to keep it. However, they dissolved the natural ally of Germany, the Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary, and actually all 3 multinational powers which dominated the eastern half of the continent for centuries was partly destroyed or shrunken, and Central Europe became, as we say, Balkanized. Small countries were created, and the new creations served the French policy, actually. They wanted to build, and did build, a certain little entente behind Germany, a kind of cordon sanitaire. And serving this, they actually created pretty artificial countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, never existed before. And these countries did not exist for long, as we know. In 10 years, they were already in deep crisis. Anyway, I got the message I have 1 full minute yet, so I want to exploit it. The major issue is that because there's tremendous difficulties and abuse of the peace treaty, the peripheries of Europe revolted against the regime. And there were communist revolts in Russia, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and communist revolutionary attempt in Germany and Austria. They were defeated, except Russia. And Russia introduced the world's first non-market, centrally planned economy, an alternative economic regime to capitalism. The other peripheries, mostly in the southern regions of Europe, had a fascist revolt, fascist revolution. Italy started in 1922. Of course, humiliated Germany in 1933. Spain followed, Portugal followed, Greece followed the fascist examples. And all of the other newly created and most of the peripheral countries in Eastern Europe became semi-fascist authoritarian regimes, natural allies of Hitler and Mussolini. So war preparation actually started at the end of the First World War, became absolutely explicit during the 1930s, and therefore historians nowadays are speaking about the 30 years war of Europe with an armistice in between, which was the interwar decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, to sum that up, Marshal Foch in 1919 is believed to have said, he was the French Supreme Commander, this is not a peace, this is a truce for 20 years. And he was right, almost to the year. Our next speaker is Professor James Gelvin. He specializes in the social and cultural history of the modern Middle East, particularly the area known as Greater Syria, in the 19th century down to the present day. He is the author of 4 books, including Divided Loyalties, Nationalism and Mass Politics in Syria at the Close of Empire. Another one, The Modern Middle East, A History, and most recently, The Arab Uprising, What Everyone Needs to Know. I think that's the one to go out and buy. So, my colleague, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Gelvin.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it's also the cheapest of them, so I get less royalties for it. I would like to thank everybody as well, but I have a harsh taskmaster, and it's going to be taken out of my time. So consider yourselves thanked, particularly the donors who provided us with this opportunity. When we think of the First World War, certain images come to mind, and among those images are troops on the Western Front, trench warfare, etc. But among the combatants, the Ottoman Empire was possibly the most devastated of all the places. For example, the casualty rates in France were about 9% of the population, in Germany about 11% of the population. In the Ottoman Empire, it was between 12 and 25% of the population died during the war. Same thing with Persia, Same thing with Persia. About 25, up to upwards of 25% of the population died. A lot of the wounds were self-inflicted. For example, 1.5 million Armenians were killed by the Ottomans in the first recorded genocide, actually. And half of Mount Lebanon starved to death because of inadequate provisioning. So the Ottoman Empire actually had a massive demographic shift along with Persia that took place as a result of the First World War. But I want to talk about something else. What I want to talk about is the political legacy that the First World War has left behind. And that political legacy is twofold for the sake of today. First of all, the creation of the state system out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, number one. And number two, the Israel-Palestine conflict as we now know it. Let's start off with the state system. This is the Ottoman Empire in 1700 at its greatest extent. Of course, it covers 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia as well.
There we go. Whoop.
Okay. This is the Ottoman Empire on the eve of World War I. Okay, it's lost everything in Europe, mostly to Balkan nationalism. It lost almost everything in North Africa except Egypt. Again, mostly to imperialism this time. Okay, it's a very, very truncated empire. This is a state system that came out of the Ottoman Empire. Very, very different from the way the Middle East had been organized before. How did the state system come to be? Well, there were two ways in which states were created in the aftermath of the First World War. The first way was through force of arms, popular rebellion, revolution. This took place in Turkey, for example, where Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was able to dislodge occupying powers of Greece, of France, of Italy, and establish the Republic of Turkey throughout the entirety of Anatolia. This also took place in Saudi Arabia, where Abdulaziz ibn Saud was able to establish the Saudi state that we have known to come and love, present day. His son, by the way, is the most recent king of Saudi Arabia. In Egypt, there was a popular revolution against the British, who had been occupying Egypt since 1882. The Egyptians managed to win partial sovereignty, but full sovereignty would not come for the Egyptians until the 1950s. And finally, there was Iran. Persia, which changed its name to Iran in 1935. It had always been an independent state, but it was a very, very loose state. At the end of World War I, a military leader took power, Reza Khan, who later became known as Reza Shah, founded a dynasty, if you can call two people a dynasty, that lasted from the 1920s to 1979. The fact that Iran is a powerful state with real institutions is a result of the post-World War I takeover of Reza Shah. Now, the other way that states were formed was through diplomacy. And when I say diplomacy, I don't mean people in the region sitting down with the imperial powers, for example, the victorious Entente powers, and deciding things. What happened was that at the end of the war, of course, everybody sat down in Paris, the victorious powers. They decided to establish a League of Nations, and as part of that League of Nations, they established something called the mandates system. The mandate system was a cross between what Woodrow Wilson wanted, which was free access to the world for American trade and open door policy, which we'll probably hear more about, and what the British and the French wanted, which was colonies. So a midway point was reached. The idea was that these places that had been liberated from the Ottoman Empire were not yet fit to stand on their own 2 feet. They could not stand up to the, quote, strenuous conditions of the modern world, and they had to be guided to meet those conditions. So Britain and France divided up the territories from the Ottoman Empire. Britain ended up with the territories that became Iraq, the territory that became Jordan, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and the territory that became Palestine and Israel. France got territories that became Syria and Lebanon. I'm very explicit, by the way, about using the terms territories that became. There was no such thing as Iraq. There was no such thing as Transjordan. There was no such thing as Syria. There was no such thing as Lebanon. These were post-war creations that were made by the Entente powers who divided up responsibility for the region. So, thus being the case, why are these states still around? It seems to be that they would be extraordinarily unstable. Well, the state system in the Middle East has actually turned out to be one of the most stable state systems in the world. The last major change that took place is that we've reduced the number of Yemens from 2 to 1. Pretty soon it's going to be back to 2, though. There are two reasons why this stability has taken place in the Middle East. The first has to do with the passage of time. Within this period of time, since the First World War, all the way to the present time, states have engaged their citizens in common practices. States have worked to develop their own national histories. They've set up borders. They have their own national traditions at the present time. They have their own centralized market at the same time. And they produce their own histories to differentiate themselves from other states as well. This is why during the most recent Arab uprisings, what we see is Egyptians using the Egyptian flag, for example, as a prime symbol of overthrowing Mubarak. Or Syrians still, to this very day, in their demonstrations, using the Syrian flag. They identify themselves as Syrians. The second thing that made the state system stable was the international system itself. at first the British after the war, and then the Americans would not allow a shift to take place, would not allow a change to take place in the region, simply because this would destroy a certain balance of power that had emerged in the region itself. The most recent instance, of course, that we have of this is the American-led invasion of Kuwait and then Iraq during 1991. So we have two reasons for the stability of the state system, in spite of ISIS and in spite of Al-Qaeda, which claim not to believe in a state system. As far as ISIS is concerned, this is the territory they claim as their caliphate. It's a lie, by the way. It's far more territory than they actually have. If you want to see where ISIS is heading, according to their own propaganda, it's this map here. Notice Andalus, Spain, is part of the Islamic Caliphate. Okay. So what is likely to happen in the near future is that ISIS will probably be destroyed. It is an extraordinarily weak organization in spite of its victory, which was fortuitous. And the state system will probably remain in place with possibly two exceptions. And those two exceptions are Yemen and Libya. And the only reason why the international community is going to tolerate them falling apart is because they are so peripheral to the region and to the international order. Syria and Iraq will be patched together. They won't be real states, but they will be what Lakhdar Brahimi, who was the UN envoy, called. He called the process Somalization. In other words, Syria and Iraq will be just like Somalia, have a permanent seat at the United Nations, and not have effective control over its own territory. That's probably what's going to happen in the future. Second thing that I want to talk about is the Israel-Palestine conflict and the way that emerged. Now, of course, Zionism had been Jewish nationalism, is a 19th century phenomenon before the war. And many Zionists followed the idea that if they could get a great power to actually endorse the Zionist project of building a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, then they would be able to actually accomplish that. Nationalisms, after all, don't work or not work because they're right or they're wrong. They work because they're backed by somebody. They work because they're financed by somebody. They work simply because you can put them in place. And the same thing with Zionism. During the First World War, the British promulgated what became known as the Balfour Declaration. Poor Balfour. His name is associated with this declaration forever, in spite of the fact that he didn't write it, in spite of the fact that it was the cabinet itself that passed on it. It was just, as foreign minister, his name went on it. The Balfour Declaration said that the British government view with favor the establishment of a homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people. Okay? Simple as that. This declaration was later integrated into the mandate, so it had the legal binding at that point. And also, the British took on the task of facilitating Jewish immigration to Palestine as well. And that's why we see from the first Zionist immigration in 1882 to 1914, there were 75,000 Jews who emigrated from Europe to Palestine. Between 1919 and 1939, when restrictions were once again put on Jewish immigration, there were 375,000 Jews who emigrated to Palestine. In other words, what you had now was a core of a community that could actually build institutions, which was again facilitated by the British. They were the ones who ensured that the Jewish community in Palestine was able to maintain itself. Why would the British be so nice to Jews? It's so out of character. We don't know. Historians have been debating this for a while. One of the ideas is that it would be great to have a pro-British Jewish homeland near the Suez Canal to protect the Suez Canal. Another reason is what's called patrician anti-Semitism, the idea of the British thinking that the Jews controlled Woodrow Wilson, Felix Frankfurter, Louis Brandeis, and that this thing that was going on in Russia with the Bolsheviks, nobody could take that seriously, so that had to be a Jewish plot. So if they were nice to the Jews, then therefore the Russians would stay in the war, and the Americans as well, who the British didn't really trust because of Wilson's call for peace without victory. More likely, however, is one of the reasons that Lloyd George gave in his memoirs. He actually gave a number of reasons, 9 to be exact. The least probable was his declaration that, quote, the democratic powers of Europe had always advocated emancipation of the subject races held down by great empires. Yeah. Except maybe India and Ireland. Most convincing, however, is his assertion that, quote, it was part of our propaganda strategy for mobilizing every opinion throughout the world which might weaken the enemy and improved Allied chances. In other words, it couldn't hurt the war effort and it might even help. The British thought that this was just a minor undertaking, and I think over the past 90 years or so, what we've seen is that they were sadly mistaken. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Professor Glenda Sluga. She is Professor of International History and Australian Research Council Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellow at the University of Sydney. She directs a program there on the history of internationalism, which is what she's going to talk about, and she is currently working on a history of the Congress of Vienna and a study of the early years of the United Nations. There's a certain parallelism I detect there. Recent works, in 2013, she published Internationalism in the Age of Nationalism, and forthcoming shortly, again, go out and buy it, Women, Diplomacy and International Politics Since 1500, which is a new take on international diplomacy and perhaps to introduce a note of gender into it somehow. Anyway, Professor Sluga.
Okay, thank you very much. I will take a minute to just thank UCLA History Department for inviting me to this evening. It's such a pleasure, despite the topic, to be here with these extraordinary intellects and to be in your company. I'm the odd one out in a number of ways, as you can tell, but most importantly, I suppose, because I'm going to just shift tack a little bit in the discussion in order to discuss what I call the international legacy of the First World War. So I want to make an argument for investing in what I call the memory of the war and the peace as an important international moment, and understanding the changed international political landscape for the rest of this that took place and affected the rest of the century. And we've heard a bit about that from the other speakers in terms of the changing state system and the new international system. But here I want to examine the new international order built on the principles of not only national self-determination, but also the creation of the League of Nations. And I want to argue that this international legacy is a critical component of national histories, including, of course, an American past. Now, at the moment, blocking this international memory are not only the inward-looking national concerns of the commemoration industry, and we can talk about that in the question time, but also a long-held historical assumption that in contrast to the impetus of nation and empire in the First World War, that the extent of interest in institutional and legal internationalism that led to the creation of the League of Nations was insignificant, that it really was not relevant to what happened during the war or after. By contrast, there is, I think, an increasing amount of historical evidence, a lot of it social history, that is bringing to our attention the extent of this wartime engagement with the idea that peace was dependent on a new international political architecture and that any institutionalised internationalism had to balance the interests of patriotism and humanity. So it didn't reject nationalism, but it wanted to bring nationalism into discussion with this idea of a broader humanity and internationalism. In other words, by the end of the war, internationalism was a mainstream idea, inextricable from the history of nationalism. So my starting point does take me into Scots terrain, to Woodrow Wilson's 1918 proclamation of the 14 points, which set the benchmark for a future peace. Now, this is a commemorative card issued to celebrate the opening of the new League of Nations in 1920, and as you can see, it makes no small meal of the role of Wilson or his 14th point. And that point was, it's right at the bottom, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. So the point I want to make, though, is that by 1918, this idea of a general association of nations was not only more ambitious than this point suggests, but rather well embedded in political discussion and social organisations in the United States, in Britain, in the continent of Europe, as well as across the Pacific, although it's still the history of England that we know most about at this moment. Wilson's point would have been familiar to many of his audience outside the US Congress, as well as inside it, because of the extent of wartime discussion of a post-war international government of some kind, and because of the layers of the pre-war experience of international life on which that same discussion was built. So before the war, well actually on the eve of the war, you would have been able to read Robert Lansing talking about the 20th century as the century of internationality. Now, Lansing ended up being Wilson's Secretary of State. Now, he thought that just as nationality had driven progress in the 19th century, internationality, this word that we don't use anymore, would compel the future. Now, this word internationality was meant to reflect the changing nature of political and economic life as it was understood at the time. In the decade before the war, the view had spread that as technology of steamships and telegraph cables was bringing the world ever closer, commerce required national governments to think about facilitating trans-border communication and transport. This was the period before the war that saw the rise of intergovernmental organisations and administrative bodies to manage postal services, telegraph services, trans-border issues such as labour and health. International law was regarded as a fundamental framework for all these developments and as crucial to the forms of arbitration that would guarantee peace over conflict in the context of a world of rivalrous empires, military stockpiling and the threat of imperial wars. Now, the outbreak of war pushed the significance of what were termed public international unions at the time in new directions. Allied governments applied the principles of transnational cooperation to the organisation of transport, food supplies and munitions. And as academics and statesmen promoted the idea that a post-war international government of some kind or other was an important ambition for a peaceful post-war order, they were building on these pre-war experiences. Now, this is most noticeable in England because of the historical work that's been done, and where after a first burst of nationalist abandonment of the international associations that had existed, new international associations were soon set up across Middle England in support of a future League of Nations. And that was the term that was used. These associations were the work of statesmen in office, as well as Oxbridge Dons, and even though they were run by men, they relied on the activities of women's organisations such as the Jewish Women's Union and the Church Army Girls' Clubs in England. And the link between this English story and the American one can be traced in transatlantic intellectual networks. And here, in particular, there was the idea that the United States, the federalist experiment of the United States, was in fact a very good model for thinking about international government in the post-war. And during the war, it's the East Coast in particular that pulses with associations of international lawyers and Quakers and bankers, as well as academics and politicians, keen to take up law and institution-focused internationalism. To give you a few examples, crazy as they seem now, in 1915, the Massachusetts legislature passed a resolution favouring a world state unhindered by national sovereignty. Key Republican figures in the League to Enforce Peace talked about a higher will than the nation and the likelihood of having to surrender some measure of sovereignty. And you could find people like the president of Columbia University or of Stanford, or in fact leading African-American figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois, all talking about a League of Nations. So by the time the Victor governments assembled in Paris in 1919 to sort out the terms of a peace, there was little need to sell the idea of an association of nations. There was not one delegation that did not put forward plans for federal international government of some kind. And on many expectations, the word was that historians would remember the 20th century as the era of internationalism. Of course, what the world got was diminished international governance. A League of Nations was set up with auxiliary institutions such as the International Labour Office that still exists, the predecessor of the World Health Organization, the International Health Organization. None of these had supranational powers. There was a League Council with a small group of 4 that seemed to control everything. But still, I would argue the legacy of the League is incredibly important. And in the 1930s, there were attempts to think about why it was important. And one of the views was that it had really changed the ways in which people thought about peace as a norm. The idea that it was normal to live in peace and that states had obligations to avoid war, that arbitration, democracy and social justice were international moral concerns. There were all sorts of ways in which the League story really intersects with many of the stories we've heard tonight, including trying to deal with the situation in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire with the economic crisis, the starvation, the refugee problems that occurred, and of course overseeing the mandates. And I just want to end with this particular point, and that is that what's interesting, the mandate case, I think, really highlights the extent to which, regardless of what the intention of the League's architects were, that the League itself became a really important space in which people who felt they didn't have representation in other contexts, in their own colonial contexts, or even in their own nation states, thought that they could appeal to the League as a body that would listen to their voices. And that goes for the Jewish minorities in East Central Europe as well. So to conclude, I'm not arguing that the League was a resounding success, or not problematic, or not paradoxical even, or that internationalism was more important than nationalism as a legacy of the war. Rather, I'm arguing for the importance of recovering the history of how a future after the war was imagined, even during the war itself, of the horizon of expectations that shaped 20th century political debate and institutions. Because without those expectations, the 20th century would have looked radically different. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda. Now, our next speaker is Scott Berg, and he is the author of 5 best-selling biographies, studies of great 20th century American cultural figures. These books include Max Perkins, editor of Genius, which received the National Book Award, his book on Lindbergh, winner of the Pulitzer, his biography, and this is where it becomes directly relevant, biography of President Wilson. So he will be talking, I think, about that.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Yes.
So
And be sure to buy the book on Wilson.
there you go. And so I'm here because of Wilson, not because of my mother. Is really the important point. I've so enjoyed hearing all of this, and mostly because you've covered the world. I am going to spend a good part of my seconds talking about the United States, since I will be speaking on behalf of Wilson here. The war, so terrible, especially when you hear those opening statistics, and what makes it even more terrible is it was an unnecessary war. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson believed to the end of his life that had there been a League of Nations up and running in 1910, 1912, 1914, quite specifically, that war would not have happened. It certainly did not have to happen. Wars, terrible though they are great game changers. Obviously, they represent upheavals socially, economically, politically, every which way. And out of that often come these sometimes positive changes in the world. Whatever they are, though, wars become the milestones. And life changes almost everywhere until the next war. So what I wanted to discuss were a few of these changes, these legacies that are still with us today as a result of the First World War, the Great War. Just to open, you should bear in mind the United States in 1914 had a population of a little more than 100 million people. We were an isolationist country, happily bounded on either side by a great ocean. We were relatively pacifistic. We were still more of an agrarian nation than an industrial nation. War broke out in 1914. Woodrow Wilson asked the nation for a policy of strict neutrality, not just politically, but neutral, he said, in thought. You mustn't even have thoughts that would take one side or the other, even though secretly he had all these thoughts about how much he didn't like Germany and how much he loved Great Britain. But he kept that to himself. And things began to change 1914 into 1915, exactly 100 years ago this spring, as I'm sure we will be hearing about in the next few months, was the sinking of the Lusitania, which had been one of the greatest ships on the sea, the poshest, largest, fastest ship, and it had been requisitioned by the British Navy, and passengers could still ride. But indeed, in May of 1915, the Lusitania did a crossing. It was carrying arms. It was also carrying a few hundred American citizens. The Germans torpedoed this ship. About 1,200 souls were lost, including 128 American lives. Now, here's a moment where the discussion in this country really changes, because now we have real sides about what should America's role be now that Germany has torpedoed this ship and neutrals, we are neutral in thought, has gone down. So what does all this mean? Well, we had some people, like the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who was arguing for more neutrality, got so upset with Wilson in responding to the Lusitania for coming down what he thought was too hard on Germany, that William Jennings Bryan ultimately left the cabinet. You had Senator T.P. Gore of Oklahoma, who parenthetically was the grandfather of Gore Vidal, who was saying, Americans, you were warned that the Germans are torpedoing in the sea. You shouldn't have gotten on that boat. And Americans, you should stay home. It's as simple as that. And then you had people like Teddy Roosevelt, obviously, who said, that's the equivalent of nuke them. We've got to go out there and get them and kill the Hun. So here we have it. Now, Wilson is still maintaining his public neutrality, but the handwriting is clearly on the wall, and he is moving us more and more toward the war as late as January of 1917. And here's one of the just sort of forgotten legacies of World War I. And it's a small thing in some ways, but we have it a century later. But Wilson, as we're getting closer and closer to entering the war, wanted an armed ship bill passed. And there were 11 senators in the United States Senate who believed that was bringing us one step closer to war. They refused, and on the eve of Wilson's re-inauguration in March of 1917, it came up for this vote, and they filibustered. And it just died. And then the 64th Congress went out, a new Congress came in, and it was going to be a while before all this was going to get resurrected. Woodrow Wilson was so furious that he went to the Senate and he said, I believe in filibuster. It's part of the American way, but we need something called cloture. And if you can get 2/3 of the Senate to close a filibuster, to end debate, we must have it. And indeed, from that moment on, we have had, in various forms or another, cloture to filibuster debates. In any case, we finally do go to war. We learned that Germany was conspiring with Mexico to invade the United States. There were many other circumstances. A dozen ships had gone down, torpedoed by the Germans. And now Woodrow Wilson comes up with what I consider the most important speech in American foreign policy, and embedded in that speech famously is a single sentence. If you've heard me talk about Woodrow Wilson, you've already heard this little bit, but it warrants repeating, and that is this. In the middle of Wilson's speech, in which he asked the Senate to have a declaration of war against Germany, he said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Now, this may be the greatest legacy of World War I, or at least the most important, at least as far as the United States is concerned, for several reasons. The first is that one sentence, whatever it means, the world must be made safe for democracy. Well, who said? Well, Woodrow Wilson said, because of his own personal morality. And this is the key thing about that for the first time, really, a president, Wilson, had introduced this keen sense of morality to American foreign policy. And this would cross the seas to Versailles, and indeed this broader humanity that we have talked about, really, I think, stems from that Woodrow Wilson line. The line also becomes, for good or for bad, the foundation of all American foreign policy since 1917. Every incursion, whatever country we have gone into or not gone into but talked about going into, all goes back to that moral imperative of Woodrow Wilson's, that the world must be made safe for democracy. And indeed, from that moment on, this great sleeping giant, the United States, which had been involved in some minor incursions in Mexico and Haiti and so forth, awakened. And now we were on the path to becoming the first modern superpower. And so it went. Now, here are some legacies that happened here at home once we went to war. This is the moment, and this is the reason, or one of the reasons, that I think Glenn Beck, for example, said Woodrow Wilson is the most evil man who ever lived. He is 5 places ahead of Adolf Hitler on this list, I should add. And I think one of the reasons he maintains this is that it was the moment that government went big in this country. Because in order for this quiet nation suddenly, this isolationist power suddenly to get into the big war, that meant an alphabet soup of boards, of agencies, of commissions, of committees. That meant thousands and thousands of people who are now working for the federal government. So that's a great legacy that we have. Wow. Woodrow Wilson hired the biggest men in business to go basically to work with the military, and it's really the beginning of the military-industrial complex. It didn't have that name yet, but so it became. The economy changed drastically at this time. Woodrow Wilson did not invent the income tax, but he introduced a modern income tax during the war years. Some rates, which had been 1% to 2%, for some people went up to 67%. Now, this was a very new tax, and suddenly people are paying 67%. It's the first time we had something called a debt ceiling, which Secretary of Treasury McAdoo asked for, so that we could go out and sell war bonds, and he didn't have to go to the Senate every time he wanted to do that, to get permission to do that. We built an army. We had a Selective Service Act. Suddenly, the whole nation was thrown into this draft, you see. And so a Harvard graduate could be in a trench somewhere with some bum from the street. Or race. This is the other big thing that began to change during the First World War, one of the legacies. African Americans did fight in this war, they served in this war, and they came back from this war thinking they had earned their stripes as full Americans. And they discovered they did not, and I don't think it is by coincidence that the summer of 1919 is the summer, the Red Summer, the very bloody summer of 24 major race riots all over this country. It is because of World War II that women entered the workplace in a big way for the first time, and it is also because of World War I, and it's because of World War I that women got the vote. Woodrow Wilson had thought it should be done state by state, but once we were in the war, Wilson believed that this should have a constitutional amendment, and it was at this moment, because he felt the women were an integral part of the war effort, and because he felt, how can we be fighting for peace and freedom overseas and not be guaranteeing it to everyone here, that he argued strenuously for that. It was the moment that we had severe sedition acts, which Wilson imposed, and as a result of that, the American Civil Liberties Union also cranked up. Agriculturally, we became the great breadbasket of the world, and it is also where we got daylight savings time. Because Woodrow Wilson thought if we have an extra hour of sunlight every day, that's an extra hour of farming that we can have. Now the United States gets into the war, his 14 points, the League of Nations, introducing a few phrases that are with us today in either the phrases themselves or the policies. Collective security. This was really the first time in modern history that we had an organization, the League of Nations, that was advocating that. Self-determination. How were these countries, these states that were being divided up, how was all that decided? And self-determination was a very key aspect for Woodrow Wilson. One part of the world we haven't talked about, sitting at the conference in Paris, was Japan, kept its counsel throughout most of these talks until the very end. Italy had walked out, and now Japan says, oh, by the way, we would like part of China. We would like Shantung. And it was at this moment Wilson realized, if I don't give it to them, they will walk out as they had threatened, and everything will fall apart. And so they got it, and this may be, and I can't measure this, but this may be one of the longest lasting legacies, or most important legacies of the war, and that is, as a result of that, on May 3rd in 1919, word spread to China that basically the Versailles Conference, the Paris Conference, had sold out and had basically given Japan Shantung to manage. And as a result of that, on May 4th was a very famous protest. And among the protesters, a man who got radicalized that day was Mao Zedong. And this is the moment this former college student, finding himself, became a very radicalized newspaper man. And one other quick thing to get in here, the war is over, and one doesn't necessarily think of this on a political historical panel, but at the end of the war, there was this post-war disillusionment. We had a prohibition during or just after the war, but it was argued because it was a war measure. As a result of that, a lot of Americans went overseas after the war, expatriates, a lost generation. Well, Amory Blaine, F. Scott Fitzgerald's hero, he talks about his war experience in This Side of Paradise. Where did Jay Gatsby meet Daisy Buchanan? That was at Camp Taylor during World War I. William Faulkner's first book, A Soldier's Pay, was a war novel. E.E. Cummings, Dos Passos, Hemingway, all as a result of World War I. And finally, who was in Paris at that time for the United States? Herbert Hoover. Who was managing Feeding Europe after the war, Franklin Roosevelt, who was the Undersecretary of the Navy, Christian Herter, the Dulles brothers. In essence, all the future leadership of this country for the next generation had all been there in Paris. So the legacy is rather endless. Almost every facet of life today has some antecedent in World War I. Thank you. Sorry, I went too.
Now, we've got about 20 minutes left. I would like to pose a question to the panel so we can talk for a few minutes about it and then open the floor for discussion and finish around 8:30 or so. And it seems to me that we've had four very penetrating analyses so far, but we've been discussing, essentially in a way, we've been doing Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. There is an elephant or two elephants in the room that we haven't talked about so far. One is Bolshevism and the other is fascism. And I would like to ask the panelists to say briefly how this relates to what they've been talking about. Let me kick off by saying very briefly that fascism, Mussolini's fascism, grows directly out of World War I, that you cannot conceive of the Mussolini regime without World War I. It's a direct result. The climate of violence created by World War I, the battalions of shock troops that were created for the Italian army become the shock troops of the fascist bully boys. The peace treaty that the Italians lose in 1919, they don't get what they want because Wilson tells them they're not going to get it. They go home, they complain about a mutilated peace. Italian patriotism, Italian national feeling is outraged. And this leads directly to what is effectively a low-level civil war in Italy between 1919 and 1922, in which you have the left and the right squaring off, and Mussolini emerges as the leader of one of the little groups called fasci, groups of street fighters, and eventually pulls these all together, and then blackmails the regime, the king, and the church, and the cabinet, and the political class into allowing him to become prime minister in October 1922. And they choose this because essentially they're faced with the choice between the reds and the blacks. Do we want the red shirts or the black shirts? And what they get, they decide, is the black shirts. And so fascism comes to power, Mussolini becomes the great national leader, and he becomes the prototype for fascist regimes later on that will, one after 1933, which will do things on a much grander scale than he ever did. Now, the model for Mussolini's one-party state was the Bolsheviks. And so, in a sense, all of World War I leads to fascism and Bolshevism. We need to talk about that. So, Ivan.
Thank you. I was crazy enough to keep my 10 minutes, so I could not speak about this before. But I give it back.
I had volunteered to do it for him.
I sat near to him, so he's the only one who could. Anyway, absolutely true. Of course, Bolshevism, fascism, both as an ideology already born before the war. The Bolshevik Party became an independent party separated from the Social Democratic Party in 1912, so before the war. But the war and the suffering of the war and the devastation of the war led to the revolt of the peripheries. This both phenomenon is European peripheral phenomenon. Backward countries. Russia was one of the most backward countries of Europe. Italy was also among them, especially the south. So the backward countries, all of a sudden, people had arm in hands. That was a major case, who never had arm before. And they wanted to create an ideal society as they thought about it. Both actually, I call both systems, Italian fascism and Russian Bolshevism, they introduced modernization dictatorships. They wanted, and that was number one target, to catch up with the advanced West industrialize fast, keeping modern technology. Mussolini was famous to drive tractor, to mechanize agriculture.
Without his shirt.
Yeah, because that was...
Just like Putin.
Yeah, that was his major proudness, the huge breast, yeah. Anyway, this kind of revolutions, both dictatorial, both targeted economic modernization, both were highly nationalistic, actually, in spite of the Bolshevik international rhetoric. They were national regimes. Both introduced economic nationalism, which actually dominated Europe in the interwar decades. So a new alternative era was born after the war. And I should add, which is somewhat more general to that, I suggest you to read Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, especially in book clubs. It's good to read that, because that shows that the war destroyed a whole old lifestyle. When people had no passport, could travel with money in pocket, could exchange it in another country, and they did so, and that all disappeared with the war, and huge, strong dictatorial regimes replaced that. Thank you.
Thank you. James, briefly, please.
I'll be very brief, because this, of course, is Yvonne's field, and I thank him very much for this. You're a new country, right? Whether it's Czechoslovakia or a country in the process of formation like Syria or Libya, or Lebanon, or, for example, Turkey or Persia, for that matter. How do you go about now establishing yourself? Well, the first Great Depression that occurred after the First World War occurred in 1921. And then, of course, you have an economic collapse in 1929 as well. So something has to be done in order to maintain yourself as a state. Something has to be done in order to alleviate the problems of your population. And there's only a few models that you can draw from. There is what becomes the welfare state in Europe. There is the New Deal paradigm in the United States, which was really not suitable for export, but more suitable was actually fascist economics, and in part also Bolshevism. So the two models that actually were dominant in, number one, Iran, and number two, Turkey, were actually Mussolini's economic structures, the way he structured his economy. Okay, so that's the first influence on this. Secondly, there is this much overrated sympathy that there was in various places in the Middle East towards the non-British, non-French, okay, meaning, of course, either the Italians or the Germans. The most famous example in overrated in importance is Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian leader. There was the Golden Square people in Iraq. There was Pierre Gemayel, for example, in Lebanon, who actually founded a group called the Falange that was named after the Spanish Falange, the fascist in Spain as well. There were also, by the way, quite a few others from outside the Middle East, including Bose from India and so on and so forth. So a lot of the attraction that was held by the Germans and the Italians were, number one, they were winning early on, and number two, they were anti-British, anti-French. And the British and the French were the dominant colonial powers in the region. Finally, during the war, there was a whole bunch of secret treaties that were signed among the Allies. And, of course, Tsarist Russia was one of the Allies, and this divided up the Middle East. So when the Bolsheviks took power, they had a great time in publishing the secret treaties. You see to this very day a very, very strong anti-imperialist streak within the Middle East, large measure, because of the way in which these things were supposed to divide up the region. Al-Qaeda and ISIS still talk about something called the Sykes-Picot borders. Now, they don't really exist, but in the minds of Middle Easterners, the idea that these borders, that the imperialists were actually going to divide up the region, thanks to the information, of course, they got from the Bolsheviks, still is very, very potent weapon that is used to mobilize populations that, into an anti-imperialist frame.
Okay, so I think you've picked on two really important movements, of course, for explaining a number of things about the League of Nations, its origins and its demise. So firstly, you could argue that if it hadn't been for the Bolshevik Revolution, there wouldn't have been as much interest in the great powers in creating a League of Nations. Because the idea was that this was the internationalism that would rival the attraction of Marxist internationalism, a liberal internationalism focused on law and institutions and the idea of democracy. And secondly, you probably wouldn't have had an international labour organisation, which was, to a significant extent, a product of American thinking, and it was, again, set up to rival the attraction of the Bolshevik Revolution and what was being promised for workers who were looking on and thinking, oh, maybe that's what we need. So no, you have the ILO, you have the League, you'll be fine. And on the other hand, the fascists, well, there's very interesting new work being done on the role of fascism at the League because, of course, Italy was one of the four powers that was in control of the Council of the League, the main body. And for a while, fascist Italy was happy to have its representatives there go along with what was happening at the League. It, in fact, set up its own international institutions. And, it was like having legitimacy through participation at the League of Nations. But by the 1930s, the latter part of the 1930s, it's clear now from the new work that's being done that there was a lot of manoeuvring of politics in the League in order to undermine the power or the influence of the other non-fascist delegates. So the fascist party, the Italian fascists, used the League to its own ends, which didn't augur well for the status of the League by the late 1930s.
Until the invasion of Ethiopia.
Yes, exactly. And I'll be very brief, just to remind you that the elephant in the room wasn't in the room, and that was Russia was not present at the table in Paris. And so all this was being discussed and going on, and Russia simply wasn't there. The world was a jump ball, but there were so many little civil wars everywhere. So many countries were jump balls within themselves. Wilson's attitude basically was, I can only deal with what's in the room here. And he could only see that far, and his job was to keep everybody within that room. There were some efforts made, especially by a young representative in the American delegation, William F. Bullitt, who actually went to Russia and saw Lenin and came back and said, we should work with him in this and that. Everything Wilson had heard about Lenin, he did not like. While all this was going on, and this is another point to make about the rise of Bolshevism, was the rise of anti-Bolshevism as well. And that is the likes of Winston Churchill came down to Paris to say, you must exclude these people. These are terrible people. We must keep them out. We must do what we can to extinguish them, get them out of the process here. Italy, Orlando walked out of the conference. Again, Wilson thought he was bending over backwards for a while to keep him there, but finally the way Italy was being cut up, and Orlando felt he was not getting everything Italy was entitled to. He left, and Wilson just had to move on, basically. So he really wasn't, I don't think, focused much, if at all, on the fascist problem or the situation. He was just trying to corral everybody there and make the most of it.
Okay. Now, we have about 10 minutes for questions. So, yes.
I think you have to get up and use the microphone.
Can we do a mic?
Why don't you bring the mic to him?
Yeah.
The mic to him.
You can't really move the mic, so yeah.
That's it.
There you
You guys could film the mic.
Yeah, please keep the questions brief.
Given the deep historical background, does the panel feel that they may be in any better position to make predictions about what's going to go on with, for example, the situation in Greece, the Middle East, and Palestine, or this historical background doesn't give you any more power to make predictions that may have some degree of, I don't know what you'd call it.
Not me, I fold.
Any volunteers?
Yeah, a couple of things. Number one, we look at the Arab uprisings, for example, and we look at it country by country, and we look at it in terms of the politics. The rock on which all these uprisings are going to crumble is going to be the economies. I mean, all the economies, now even the oil economies, okay? And there's only one game in town, and it's the IMF's game. And Greece is going to try to buck that. I doubt they're going to have very much success in doing it. In terms of other things, however, as I stated, the state system that was put in place in the Middle East has been intact, has been very, very stable, actually, for a very long period of time, for a variety of reasons. The reason why we have declared war on ISIS is not because American diplomats were threatened or because we care so much about Yazidis who nobody had ever heard of before, probably in this room, except with one exception. The reason why we went to war against ISIS was to preserve the state system, to preserve Iraq, to preserve Syria. And this is the sort of thing that's been going on since 1919 or so, that this is the way the state system has been able to maintain itself.
Yeah, just Greece. You mentioned that this talk did not give much munition to understand that. So Greece was also a modern country, created as an independent country in 1830. And before that, for 400 years, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And this is what historians call past dependence. So these countries, which were created in the early 20th centuries, had a long historical bad legacy in many ways. Look at the taxation morale, corruption. All of these countries had bad legacy, lack of a kind of civilizing independent statehood for hundreds or thousands of years. So in some way, we can understand better why these peripheral countries are always in a way bad situation. Even nowadays, when economically per capita GDP sense, they very near, I mean, Italy, Greece, Spain, very near, or Ireland to Western Europe, but still they have a different behavioral pattern, different cultural background, and that explains very much.
Can I just take that up in a different way? I mean, it's such a good question. And I think, historians, we are kind of disinclined to think of ourselves as people who can predict the future. And I don't think we can. But I do think that we learn lessons about, the unpredictability of the present future. And I think one of the interesting aspects of the debate about the origins of the First World War right now is the emphasis that's being placed on the fact that when the war broke out, most people thought it wouldn't happen. So there wasn't a predictability about that war. The other thing I'd say is that, if you're looking for, important points of recognition or in resonance, then the whole, memorialisation of war and conflict is a really interesting one, because there seems to be a lot of the First World War, played out memories of earlier wars. And after the First World War, as we've heard, of course, there were also new kinds of, memories, distorted and disputed memories about the causes of the war and the outcomes of the war that played into the origins of the Second World War. And the third point I'd want to make is thinking about what happens now is interesting, in part because I think the world is a bit more like the world was in the First World War, and that is that to the extent that we have international institutions, they're very weak. And a lot of how we deal with the bigger challenges of today, including conflict, tend not to go through, if you think of ISIS, don't go through the international institutions. So you could both argue that we're in a similar situation or in a very different one from a lot of the 20th century in terms of where people turned in times of crisis.
Next, another question? Yes, there was somebody in the middle, yes. Can you stand up?
Yes. I understand that we cannot know what would have happened because it didn't happen. But what is the panel's feeling if the United States had been actively a participant in the League of Nations? Might a lot of the problems going towards World War II and beyond, and everything that was set up in Europe nowadays, at the end of World War I, is now dissolved, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, etc. Might World War II, though, have been somewhat mitigated?
Who would like to answer?
I like counterfactual, actually. And there is a parallel which may explain something. After the Second World War, France actually wanted to do exactly the same as after the First. Create several German states instead of one, annexation of certain territories, crippling Germany. The United States did not allow that. Of course, it was not only a moral or humanitarian motivation, but the Cold War, which started immediately emerging at the end of the Second World War. But actually, the Truman administration forced France to accept the American policy regarding Germany, not taking revenge, not crippling Germany. Germany needed for reconstruction of Europe and, of course, in the Cold War. So this parallel may show that an American participation could change the entire peace process.
Anyone else?
Well, I was just going to say that Woodrow Wilson certainly felt everything would have changed. I mean, if you believe idealistically, as he did, and he knew it was a flawed treaty, but he felt it was strong enough. And he felt, I mean, talk about revanche and all that. I mean, he spent every day in Paris just talking Clemenceau down from, and they would finally agree on something, and the next day Clemenceau would start all over again. So he felt if that table were up and running, and if the United States were present for it, putting some teeth behind, in this organization, that it could have done some good, I think. To the point that, Germany was talking about, they wanted to be part of the League of Nations. At least that's what they were saying as they were drawing up the treaty and so forth. So one likes to think that it could have worked. And the minute the United States was not part of it, I think it seemed doomed.
Just to add a comment about Clemenceau's relationship with Wilson, Clemenceau once fumed that God Almighty only had 10 commandments. Why do we need 15?
Let me observe very briefly that perhaps without US isolationism, there would have been no need for appeasement. Next question. Yes.
In relation to the knowledge that you have about how this country should deal with the Russians, Putin, because it seems to me
Putin. What to do about Putin?
The Putin phenomenon in some way is similar to the post-First World War German situation. A humiliated great power, a humiliated superpower, which all of a sudden lost its international position, its economic position. Such a humiliated great power is very dangerous. Now, this is the essence, in my view, of the Putin phenomenon.
Okay, time for one more. Yes.
My question is related to Wilson and why Wilson, when the mandate process was set before he got there, he never realized the impact of the mandate process in which the countries of France and Germany did not have to pay to offset the land that they took in the mandate process as an offset to Germans' money that they owed. This became rather contentious, and eventually, testifying before the Congress, they didn't realize, the United States, the impact of this whole mandate process.
Okay, I'm not very up on what went on in the United States about the mandates process itself. One thing I can tell you, though, is that this self-determination of peoples, as far as Wilson was concerned, and Scott might disagree with me, was a lot of hooey. The United States tried to put together, I mean, the idea of the Charter of the League of Nations, Article 22, said that the populations of the region should be consulted in terms of what their opinions are, who should rule them, or whether they should even be ruled. Okay? So the United States suggested a commission to be put together called the King Crane Commission, after its two leaders, to go to Syria, Palestine, the greater Syria area, to find out what people wanted. The King Crane Commission was alone, or the Americans were alone, because the British and the French refused to do it. They went over there. They got several thousand petitions that were suspiciously the same. It spawned the formation of a Syrian General Congress. And the Syrian General Congress said a couple of things in its final declaration. In its final declaration, it said, number one, Syria should be undivided. That included Palestine, that included Jordan, that included even parts of present-day Iraq. Secondly, they said that if we do have to have a mandate, first of all, we are independent, but if we do have to have some sort of supervisory body, let it be the Americans, okay? This came for a lot of reasons. Number one, the British and the French had a longer history. Number two, people there had this incredible misreading of the American adventure in the Philippines, where, according to Syrian politicians, we built hospitals and roads and then left. So, undivided Syria, independent, completely independent. Independent Syria, undivided under an American mandate, which will show you some of the ambiguities of what mandates were. Are they independent? Are they not independent? If the Americans don't want it, the British, an undivided Syria, under British mandate, we will accept. Next point. Under no circumstances, did the Syrian General Congress say, will we accept in any way, shape, or form a French mandate. Okay? So, the King Crane Commission goes there, reports on this, and of course the French get the mandate for Syria and divide it up. Woodrow Wilson, 2 weeks after, according to his diaries, 2 weeks after he called for the King Crane Commission to go and investigate what the people wanted, forgot it ever existed, And the report itself was not published until 1923.
And I've just said Wilson was not that interested in the mandate system. And you were asking about Germany. He was also very mindful of not wanting to break the German bank. He really wanted, a couple of countries came to him, and as they were divvying up mandates, and said, we don't really want them ourselves because it costs a certain amount to get the structures up and running, and it behooves us to pay for that. And Wilson understood that, and he really wasn't that interested in that particular process. So I think that's the basic answer to your question. Wilson went over to Paris. He, for all his grand vision, really had one very narrow vision, and that was to get this league up and running. And the mechanics of it would take care of itself, or there would be other people to think that through. He really hadn't, I think, dealt with the mandate situation before, during, or after.
the French and the British did not pay for the land that they took from the Germans, which is a normal process, but they defined it as a mandate system, so they didn't offset some of the costs to the Germans. And this mandate system was permitted to go on without Wilson's knowledge, because in later testimony it had already been in place.
Okay.
Well, I'm afraid I think we have to cut matters off here. And I defer to our Commander-in-Chief.
Thank you. Well, let me begin by thanking the panel and our intrepid moderator for a wonderfully stimulating evening. Thank you again to the Alden-Berg families for enabling this wonderful evening. And everyone is invited upstairs to the outside area in the inside of the building on the first floor for a reception, so we can continue the conversation over food and drink.